there are parallels, as you were suggesting a few moments ago, in terms of the way Hitler quickly got control of the media. Trump obviously is trying to do this as well, although so far I think he's happily failing. But when Trump said the other day that any broadcaster whose programs criticize him should lose their license, that is so unambiguously authoritarian. There's no other way to think about that. I think that might be the most absolutely unambiguously authoritarian thing he has said or done since coming back into office in January, and that certainly raises alarming parallels.
We have a great guest, a very timely guest. He's Benjamin Hett, a professor of history at Hunter College, foremost scholar on the rise of Nazi Germany, author of half dozen books, including The Death of Democracy and The Nazi Menace. Professor Hett, the Nazis in 1932 won the most seats in the parliament, but they were a distinct minority. They had, I think, 4 leaders in the past 3 or 4 years. Hitler demands that there be a coalition, that he be the chancellor, but he came in looking pretty weak. He didn't have much in the Reichstag, and others kind of calculated. And you make this point that okay, we don't like him, he's a menace, but we'll give it to him. We can control him, and he might even be a short-termer. Yet within several months, he enacts the Enabling Act, he starts to dismantle democracy, and he's well on the way to becoming the dictator that he was. How did it happen? What lessons are there?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. Your characterization is absolutely right. Really, the story of German politics for a few years before Hitler came to power was there was kind of this dance going on where Hitler was increasingly winning over a substantial electoral following, not a majority, but by 1932, about a third of the German electorate, which made his party, the Nazi Party, the biggest party in the national parliament, the Reichstag. But under the German constitution, to get into real power, he had to have the doors open to him, specifically by the Reich president, who was the World War I Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, and kind of in a less formal way, the circle around Hindenburg, which basically represented traditional German elites, especially the military and big business. And so Hitler had to sort of win their favor if he was going to get named chancellor and get into a position of power. And this is where it got kind of interesting, because these, you might say, kind of traditional establishment conservatives looked at Hitler and his party, and they thought a sort of rabble. They didn't think much of Hitler. He had never risen above the rank of private first class in the First World War, and these guys, if they were military, they were senior officers. And he didn't speak very grammatically, even in his mother tongue of German. He was very crude, and his party looked crude. But they did have some advantages. The electoral following was a big advantage, and the fact that they were clearly anti-communist, they were clearly highly nationalist, they were clearly pro-military. All of these things commended themselves to the traditional elites, and so they thought, well, maybe we can manipulate him, maybe we can use him, as you suggested. They underestimated Hitler and thought they could control him. And eventually, like German politics, as I said, for several years was kind of a dance between these two sides, each trying to use the other. This eventually got consummated in a bargain in late January 1933, which brought Hitler to power as the chancellor with President von Hindenburg's approval into a coalition with establishment conservatives, in which of the 11 men in the cabinet, only 3, including Hitler, were Nazis. So it looked originally like a weak political position in which the traditional elites sort of had him under control, had co-opted his electoral following, and had gotten what they wanted. And of course, that turned out not to be the case.
One of the reasons it didn't was he was able to sabotage the legal system and the media. Am I correct? And he did that rather quickly. And, just tell us how I think about that today. So tell us how he did it.
Yeah, it did happen incredibly quickly. Within about 2 months, he was effectively a dictator. Right away, when his administration came into office, they started passing decrees, sort of equivalent to executive orders in the American system, which started to crack down on press freedom. They started to bring a lot of their own people into the police. There's a kind of ICE equivalent here, I think. They were starting to bring literally the Nazi stormtroopers. They were making them auxiliary police officers so they could pursue their political enemies with the authority of the police. So they are cracking down on the media. They're cracking down on free expression. There was an election campaign underway in the month of February, and the Nazis used their now control of the police often to break up speeches and rallies by oppositional parties. And then the really key moment here came on the 27th of February, when Hitler had been in office for exactly 4 weeks, and the famous incident of the Reichstag fire occurred, which is to say, somebody set a fire in Germany's parliament, the Reichstag. It destroyed the plenary chamber at the heart of the building, didn't really damage the main structure of the building, but it did knock out the chamber. And right away, Hitler said, oh, it was the communists who did this. Therefore, we need another emergency decree to crack down on them, which he got. President von Hindenburg signed. And that decree was very important. It allowed, first of all, Hitler to pull all of the individual rights out of the Constitution. So freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom from arbitrary arrest, confidentiality of the post, all that kind of stuff was now gone.
So that's how he got the press.
Yeah,
that's basically,
that's how he completed the process. And that, at that point, Germans really have no rights. Very importantly, and sometimes overlooked, is that the second part of the decree said that his national government, Germany is a federal system then and now, like the United States, and Hitler was running essentially the federal government, but the decree gave him his government, the power to take over the state governments if he deemed them not fulfilling their requirements to maintain order. So that also helped him consolidate his dictatorship, because he made very thorough use of this and took over state governments that were somewhat oppositional, particularly the state government of the state of Bavaria. The Reichstag fire is controversial to this day. The question is who actually said it. It's a lot like the John F. Kennedy assassination, in the sense that there was a crazy guy who was running around by himself in the building who was arrested for the fire and clearly had something to do with it, kind of Lee Harvey Oswald in this scenario. And this crazy guy, a Dutch journeyman stonemason, insisted that he had set the fire by himself. No one in 1933 believed him. Hitler said it was the communists. People who were anti-Nazi said, obviously, this was a Nazi false flag operation, precisely so they could get this decree and blame the communists. And the controversy persists. Nowadays, no one thinks it was the communists, but there is still argument among historians. Did Marinus van der Lubbe, the crazy Dutch guy, act alone, or was he a stooge in a Nazi conspiracy? I have entered into this controversy, and I have argued that and there is evidence that has come to light in recent years, which does point to this being a Nazi conspiracy, making use of van der Lubbe. But the question does remain quite hotly debated.
Well, let me talk for a minute about the business leaders. The business leaders basically went along with Hitler because they thought that, A, they could control him, he would protect them. How long did it take him to realize what a tragic miscalculation that was?
I think some of them probably never realized it. Some of them, maybe after the fact, thought it was a nice idea that had gone badly. Some realized it pretty much right away. So there was a considerable range. There were also kind of interesting patterns as to what industries were more likely to favor the Nazis than others. And there's a certain logic to it. Industries that had high labor needs, and therefore for whom unions were a significant issue, they were much more likely to back Hitler because they were correctly confident that he would crush labor unions. Businesses that were more export-oriented and a bit more oriented to the world were correspondingly much less enthusiastic about Hitler. Business on the whole didn't back Hitler until he was in power. They had their own political party, basically, called the German People's Party, which, despite the name, was really a big business party. And that's really what they backed prior to Hitler coming to power. But once he became chancellor and there was that last election campaign in February and March 1933, Hitler was very upfront about getting money from them. There's an account of a famous kind of fundraising meeting where Hitler gives a speech, and then his right-hand man, Hermann Goering, says to the assembled business leaders, now, gentlemen, to the cash register. And they're supposed to pony up, and they did.
That sounds rather familiar, but we'll get to that in just a minute. We're talking about Germany in 1933. I'm going to come back to that, but it's really talking about the way authoritarianism develops. I saw an interview the other day with Garry Kasparov, the great Russian chess champion, who noted that in the early Putin years, he gave business leaders, the oligarchs, big tax cuts and protections, and they all said, "Well, okay, he's going to follow in the in the footsteps of Boris, that he'll be okay. And only later did they realize they were ceding all power to him. It's different, but it's similar to what happened in Germany.
It is. It is similar, I think. I don't claim to be an expert on Russia, but I think one difference is the process went much more slowly. Business
Right.
leaders found out pretty early on who the boss actually was. I think actually, in some ways, some of our American business leaders who backed Trump rather enthusiastically last year may be coming to almost as quick a realization as to who the boss actually is now. Somewhat similar things happened in Germany. So, for instance, German steel makers started getting into conflict pretty early on with Hitler because Hitler wanted to build up the armed forces as quickly as possible. He needed a lot of steel for that. He didn't want to export any steel. They preferred to export their steel. They also preferred to get iron ore imported from Sweden because it was better quality than what they could mine in Germany. Hitler didn't want to import things from Sweden because that would then necessitate exports, and it would get in the way of, as he thought, making as much steel as possible for as many tanks as possible, as quickly as possible. And when some of the steel makers tried to resist him on this, he basically said, okay, fine, I'm starting my own steel company. And he basically did. He started a state-run steel concern to sort of do an end run around the steel makers.
Well, we're getting to the crux of the conversation now. What parallels do you see between what occurred in Germany? And I'm talking about 1933, which you've written so persuasively about. And this was before the Holocaust. They were, anti-Jewish things going on, but people weren't being sent to death chambers yet. But 1933, what parallels to what's happening in America today?
So there are some, and then I think there also are some important differences. So the parallels, among the more striking, I think, uh, for instance, the way Doge, we seem to be hearing less about this recently, but in the first few months, the way Doge was going into government agencies and so on and departments and firing people, and there seemed to be kind of a loyalty test at work. There's a fairly close parallel there. One of the first things Hitler's government did is introduce a law with a very long name, which was called the Law for the Reform of the Professional Civil Service, under which a lot of people working for the government were fired. They were basically fired if they were deemed to be Jewish or if they were deemed to be politically unreliable, with the agenda of getting very secure control by Hitler and his government over the whole government apparatus. So I think that is a bit of a parallel. I think in a rough way, ICE and the way ICE has been used and the way it is being expanded, as I was saying earlier, is a bit of a parallel to how the Nazis brought their own people into the police and then used them against political opponents. There are, we may be just sort of navigating this right now, but I think there are parallels, as you were suggesting a few moments ago, in terms of the way Hitler quickly got control of the media. Trump obviously is trying to do this as well, although so far I think he's happily failing. But when Trump said the other day that any broadcaster whose programs criticize him should lose their license, that is so unambiguously authoritarian. There's no other way to think about that. I think that might be the most absolutely unambiguously authoritarian thing he has said or done since coming back into office in January, and that certainly raises alarming parallels.
Well, the Nazis were anti-immigrant, they were protectionist, they were nationalistic, and they professed to be populist. That does have
All
a striking feel to it, doesn't it?
It certainly does. All of those things are parallels, and indeed, one of the things I argued in my book, The Death of Democracy. Well, in the book, I was not making any explicit parallels, but I did point out that the thing the Nazis were successful on in free elections, when they had to fight free elections, was really a kind of nationalist pitch against economic globalization. No one used the word globalization back in 1932 or 1933, but that's
Well,
really
that's
what
what
they
it
were
was.
talking about.
Yeah,
That's what it was.
yeah.
That's what they're talking about. Hitler, I mean, amazingly, Hitler has a very interesting passage in what is simply called his second book from 1928, in which he complains about German companies outsourcing jobs to China, which is a very interesting thing to say in 1928. And the Nazis were positioning themselves against that kind of thing. You're right, too, that they were certainly anti-immigrant. One of the lesser known features of politics in Germany in the years just before the Nazi takeover is that border security and migration were actually very big and very emotional issues. Um, Germany had a new border with Poland at that time because Poland had just come into existence after World War One, and Germany didn't have the police or military manpower to control migration flows across that border. And the Nazis made a lot of political hay out of this. But there's this unsecured border. The quote unquote weak democracy can't control it, and there were a lot of refugees. There were hundreds of thousands of refugees at that time pouring in across that border, basically because of the Russian Revolution and other bits of turbulence going on to the east of Germany. So that was a very big issue in Weimar politics. And in a certain way, I mean, you're absolutely right. The Nazis did, although again, they didn't really use the word, but they did position themselves as something we would consider to be populist. They positioned themselves as anti-elite. They positioned themselves as the real spokespeople for the real German people. Much of their rhetoric, not their practice, but their rhetoric was anti-big business and anti-capitalist to a degree, which for them also mixed in with the anti-Semitism. Although interestingly, the closer the Nazis got to power, the less overt they were about their anti-Semitism, because they knew that was not going to really be an election winning issue for them in terms of winning people over to them that were not already core supporters of them.
And they also were helped by the lack of a coherent or a coordinated opposition, weren't they?
Yes, that's absolutely right. Partisan divides in Germany before 1933 were absolutely as fierce and rigid, if not more fierce and rigid, as what we experience right now, with the added element that there were about 7 or 8 significant parties all competing for power or competing to be part of a coalition, and they kind of all hated each other. In particular, the two parties of the left that might have been the most important force to stop the Nazis, that being the Social Democrats, which were center left, and the Communists, which of course were far left, they hated each other far more, I think, than either of those parties hated anybody on the right. And they had a long history of mutual hatred and violence and division. And by the way, Russian influence was a factor here too, because in those days, the regime in Moscow, Joseph Stalin's dictatorship, was basically the boss of all world communist parties and gave orders to all world communist parties. And Stalin had ordered the German communists not to make any coalition to stop the Nazis, because Stalin thought it would be good for communism if the Nazis came to power, because that would then stimulate a final communist revolution. So if
because he'd be so bad, he too underestimated Hitler, right?
He absolutely did. And so the communists and the Social Democrats, if they could have worked together, that could have been a force that might have stopped the Nazis. But for all of these reasons, their divisions and the Russian influence, they couldn't. None of the other parties, by that point, were either large enough in support base or able to unify enough to form any kind of effective coalition to stop the Nazis.
Benjamin, let me ask you one final question. The big lie. That was central to what the Nazis did. Goebbels, Hitler, you tell the big lie, you keep telling it, you never back down from it, and the bigger the lie in some ways, the better. Again, there are similarities to what we're seeing here today.
Yes, in a way, Hitler and Goebbels, his kind of right-hand man and propagandist, they were very forward-looking, and they were really, I think, pioneers of a certain kind of disinformation politics and very calculated use of dishonesty. I mean, as you say, Hitler wrote very explicitly in Mein Kampf, in his famous sort of autobiography, that there's no point in telling small lies in politics, because people will see through those, because everybody tells small lies. So to be a successful politician, you tell absolutely massive lies. On the scale of, the big lie in the 1920s was, we actually won World War One. I mean, the Germans on the right like to circulate the idea that they hadn't actually been militarily defeated by the Allies in World War One. Germany had been betrayed by democratic politicians at home. And Hitler circulated this story. I think they were all smart enough to know it was completely untrue, but it was also electorally effective to make an anti-Western Allies argument. And Hitler stressed the fact that if you just keep telling this lie, and it's a big enough lie, no one will believe that you would tell such a big lie. And even if it gets debunked, and here too, he was very clever about this, even if the lie gets debunked in public, fragments of it will remain, and somehow people will still kind of believe it. So you might as well go out there and tell massive lies. and Hitler and Goebbels and their people did so, and they did so very politically successfully.
You know, Benjamin, I teach a course up at the University of Pennsylvania on press and politics, and one of the things I show my class is Triumph of the Will, which I think even 90 years later is as good a propaganda film as I have ever seen. I mean, she may have been a bad person, whether she was a Nazi or not, we can debate, but she certainly was a brilliant filmmaker.
Yeah, Leni Riefenstahl, she was a very skillful documentary filmmaker. She was a terrible person. I think we can take that to the bank.
Yeah.
Um, I have to say, as a historian, I actually often wish I could watch that film and watch the clips of Hitler and really understand how people saw him as charismatic, because we know that Germans did, many Germans did.
Yeah, and he doesn't
I
look charismatic. He
No,
doesn't
to
talk
me, he looks like
particularly. Yeah, he's
a ranting little twerp. But I think
yeah.
I would be a better historian if I could understand why people saw that as charismatic. I don't. John F. Kennedy or Churchill, yeah, I'm down with that. But Hitler, I don't get it.
FDR, yes, absolutely.
FDR, yeah.
Right. Well, listen, this has been a wonderful conversation. You've written 6 books, I think, but everybody out there, get Death to Democracy, Nazi Menace. They are 2 books that will teach you a great deal about an important part of history and maybe even make you think more about today. So, Ben Hett, thank you for being a great guest.
Thank you very much.